In the period between World War I and World War II, specifically in the years from 1928 to 1930, the poet T.S. Eliot published his poem Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday was, in some sense, his poem celebrating his conversion to Anglicanism. And it was a powerful poem which some rejoiced in and others felt confused by, but it was a very rich poem. And all you have to do is take your phone or tablet or computer and go to your favorite search engine and type in T.S. Eliot Ash Wednesday, and that poem will come right up, and you can read it this afternoon and reflect on it. The poem is both rich and barren at the same time. It reminds me of our sand garden, which is a great symbol for Lent. When you look at it, it's full of things. It's got plants and sand and various rocks and other things, but the whole thing itself is desert-like. And Eliot captures that dual nature of our experience as being rich and sometimes very empty all at the same time. And he captures that reality in this poem. And I believe that he reflected on this poem throughout that Lent as he was writing it, and on the scripture readings that he was hearing in church during Lent. And I really believe that he crafted a line that shows up a couple times in the poem that reflects today's readings particularly well. And that line is, "Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still." Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. And it's a line that invites reflection. Because how do we care? What does it mean to care and not to care? What's that about? What does the line mean? What is it trying to teach us? Today's readings really contain, in some ways, that line. God comes to Abram. And Abram gets right involved in his particular concerns of the moment, whether or not he's going to have a son and heir. And God says, okay, come outside and look at all the stars in the sky. That's how many descendants you will have. Now, I read that, and when I think about it, God is really giving an answer to Abram's concerns that Abram will never see in his life on earth. Right? They're his descendants. They'll be born after him. He will never see this great cloud, this great starry sky of descendants. He'll never see them. Descendants come after us. And so then I have to ask myself, what kind of answer is that? And I realize that what God has done in this episode is that he has gone beyond Abram's particular concerns and given him an answer that is bigger than his particular concerns. He has told him the big picture, as it were. And he has asked him to hold on to that. The answer that God gives him has roots in whether or not Abram has a son, yes, but those roots stretch out into the distance beyond Abram's earthly life to all of his descendants. God gives him a bigger answer and asks him to hold on to that for hope. There's a way in which teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still, is an invitation to remember the big picture. To remember in the midst of all our anxieties about our world that God is still in charge and that God has an agenda and a plan that won't be stopped. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to be still. Similarly, Jesus is on his journey towards Jerusalem and his death. He's still in Galilee. And the Pharisees, who we're used to thinking of as Jesus' enemies, the Pharisees in Luke actually treat him pretty well. I mean, they get curious about what he's teaching, but they do the polite thing, which is when you're curious about a local teacher's teaching, you invite them to dinner and you feed them well and have conversation with them. And that's what the Pharisees do in Luke. They invite Jesus to dinner and talk to him. And later they come and warn him that Herod is looking for him and wants to kill him. And Jesus says, I have a work to do, and that's not going to stop. I have a work to do that God has given me. And that work to do that God has given me is rooted in deep, old, long, eternal promises. And I'm going to keep my walk and do what God has told me to do. But let us not forget that he's doing that walk, he's maintaining that serene walk towards his death in the midst of his own feelings about Jerusalem, his own deeply mixed feelings about Jerusalem. It's easy for us to forget, but to a first century Jew, Jerusalem is the axis mundi. It's the center of the world. It's the place where the axis is around which the world turns. And the center of the world is the Holy of Holies in the temple. That room that is most often empty of people and quiet and dark. And once a year, the high priest enters that room, and it's such a holy place that when the high priest enters that room, they tie a rope to his ankle in case he should die while he's in there. They can pull him out by the rope because nobody else could go in there to get him. That part of the rite of vesting to serve as the high priest on the holiest day of the year is to have a rope tied to your ankle. This is a powerful room, a room of power and a room of holiness and sanctity and indeed, for all its quietness, a room of drama. And the high priest goes in, does what he's supposed to do, and then comes out and to the gathered crowd pronounces the not to be pronounced name of God. And it's that name, it was believed, by which God created the world, by which God wrote the Torah. It is by that name. And so that action in and of itself, that rite, that dangerous and holy and sacred rite, was an annual recreation or restart. To use today's computer terms, it was a reboot of the whole world. A powerful experience that ran deeply in the heart of Jesus and all other first-century Jews. And yet, for all of that power and glory and beauty, it was also the place where prophets went and got killed. And Jesus is full of those mixed feelings and that longing for things to be better, etc. And yet, he stays his mission. He does what he's given by his Father to do. He doesn't let himself get diverted from it by his own mixed feelings about Jerusalem, his own mixed feelings about his forthcoming death, or even Herod's sly machinations. It's the very definition of caring and not caring. Caring to do what the Father has given him to do, but not adding his own anxious, frenetic energy to the process. As one parishioner, one of your fellow parishioners told me after the 8 o'clock service, he said, "You know, you're right, Randall. It's important to not add to the noise." And I thought that was a great statement. Each of these lessons, Abram with God showing him the stars, and Jesus and Herod trying to do his thing, and the distractions that might be tempting as he's going towards his mission in Jerusalem. In both cases, Abram and Jesus are learning to trust in a promise that is bigger and more transcendent than their particular moment, than the particularities of the moment, than the particular things of the moment that make them anxious. And that doesn't mean that they're passive about it. They still care, but they don't care in a way that adds to that anxious, frenetic, noisy energy. They move forward with a serenity that can only come from a belief in the promise. A couple of Advents ago, I talked to you about the word eschatology, which in 20th century Christianity, unfortunately, came to mean a dramatic, noisy, violent end of the world where God comes back and beats people up and all kinds of bad things happen and people disappear and fight and all kinds of stuff. All of which is somebody trying to sell you something. Not in the scriptures. And I said to you that eschatology really means that our lives are defined by our futures. Our lives are defined and shaped by our future perfect life with God. And that gives us an ability to care, to keep doing our work, but to do so serenely, without adding to the noise, without adding to the anxiety and the distracted, frenetic energy. Lent is a good season to sit still for a moment and think about those promises and how those promises shape your life and who you are and how you be in the world. And it's not that we're passive or don't do anything, but it is that we don't add to the noise. That's the invitation of these readings. That's the invitation of Lent. That's what T.S. Eliot heard in the Lenten readings he heard in his new church as he worked on this poem and published it serially in the newspaper and elsewhere. That's what he meant when he wrote, "Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still." That's the invitation in any anxious time between wars and in the midst of wars and everything else. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still.